Welcome to the Sound of Resistance channel. In Russia, the interior of the Kremlin's palace does not look like a horror movie. Russian President Putin's throne is in danger of being shaken. It seems that the Kremlin and the Russian people are making intense efforts for Putin's resignation. Everywhere in Russia is chaotic. It is boiling like a witch's cauldron. The defeats of the Russian army in Ukraine caused passion in Russia to overflow. Thousands of anti-Putin demonstrations have turned Russian streets into hell. Despite all the negativities, the Russian people seem to be satisfied with the occupation that has been going on since February. This satisfaction gave way to pessimism right after the decision of Russian leader Putin to reinforce his army fighting in Ukraine. Russian leader Putin's announcement of mobilization, which included sending 300,000 soldiers to Ukraine, caused a great panic among the Russian people. After the announcement of the declaration of mobilization, Russian men made their way to border to escape from Russia. While Russian men flocked to the borders, the Russian people took the streets to protest Putin's decision to demand Putin return to his decision to mobilize. Despite all criticism and protests, Russian leader Putin managed to send Russian reserve soldiers to Ukraine. Putin recently announced the completion of the mobilization in Russia, and Putin thanked to everyone who supported him during the mobilization process. However, the situation of the Russian army in Ukraine shows the opposite of what has been described. The soldiers who joined the army after the declaration of mobilization announced by Russian leader Putin caused a great confusion. Russian President Putin was the target of the heavy criticism after the Russian barracks in Ukraine could not provide enough opportunities for the newly mobilized Russian soldiers. The reserve soldiers who were sent to Ukraine by joining the Russian army were greatly disappointed by the picture they encountered in the Russian barracks. Russian leader Putin is held responsible for the negative consequences of the declaration of mobilization in the Russian army. It looks like Russian army and Putin will pay heavily for such a plan. Vladimir Putin's trouble never goes away. Vladimir Putin faced increasing domestic pressure after Ukrainian forces recaptured a significant part of the Russian-controlled territory. The idea that Russian leader Putin does not have a chance in the election to be held in 2024 is increasing day by day. Vladimir Putin appears to be losing the war in Ukraine, as Ukrainian forces slowly retake Russian-controlled areas in massive counteroffensive launched in late August. Russian businessman Mikhail Khodorkovsky claims that if Russian forces continue their momentum in the conflict and retake their territory, the Russian president will lose power. Khodorkovsky added that regional politicians could be the key of overthrowing Putin. Russia has been facing episodic turmoil since Vladimir Putin unilaterally launched its invasion of Ukraine. Some Russian officials are too hasty for Putin to leave office. In early September, elected Russian officials from St. Petersburg launched a petition signed by at least 18 districts across the country to demand that Duma deputies dismiss Putin and overthrow him. According to the Russian constitution, the State Duma can initiate impeachment proceedings with one-third of the deputies who support the indictment of the basis of the treason or other serious crime. To effectively impeach Putin, Russia's lower and upper houses each need to pass the motion with two-thirds of the vote. Anti-Kremlin official Dmitry Palyuga, who led the petition, acknowledged that it would be difficult to impress pro-Putin lawmakers who almost unanimously supports Putin's move to expand the war in Ukraine across the country. However, Russian official Dmitry Palyuga stated that he has a huge trump card to impress the lawmakers. The Russian official is of the opinion that the influence of the Russian people in this process will be quite large. The Russian official believes that if his political campaign begins, popular pressure could change the views of both Russian parliaments and lead to his dismissal. I will probably say that the people at the federal level will see other people's reaction and at some point they will probably decide it's safer for them to get rid of Putin, Palyuga said. Everything they lost after the attacks of Ukrainian army in Putin's invasion of Ukraine was spilled on the table. The scale of Russian casualties in Ukraine is astounding. In the autumn rains and mud, as the rapid winter in the Ukrainian war approaches and ground operations have almost come to a standstill, where and at what stage is the war now? After perhaps more than 8 months of conflict? Although the war in Ukraine continues with marked brutality in places, we seem to be in natural pause in operation with little change on the front lines. From the Russian point of view, things are not looking very well. After the early returns of Kyiv and Kharkiv, the Russian army is now under pressure from Ukrainian forces in Donbas and Kherson. To the east, Ukraine looks set to continue reclaiming settlements and building land that had been captured by Russians just 4 months ago. In the south, around the city of Kherson, Putin appears to be in danger of being cut off and isolating his forces. The scale of Russian casualties to date in Ukraine is outstanding. While it is always difficult to get independently verified figures, that is general consensus among all observers that since the beginning of the conflict between the parties in Ukraine on February 24th, the Ukrainian army has lost more than 2,500 Russian tanks and more than 5,000 other armored combat vehicles. There seems to be consensus. About 270 Russian aircraft and 243 Russian helicopters were destroyed by the Ukrainian army. 70,000 Russian soldiers died in the conflict in the region, and there are thousands of wounded and missing Russian soldiers. Despite all these losses in Ukraine, Russia is trying to appear strong. However, the decrease in the arsenal of the Russian army was one of the biggest factors that accelerated the loss of soldiers in the Russian army. For example, there are signs that stockpiles of long-range precision-guided missiles and rockets are declining. Much of this can be attributed to Western sanctions, as most of the technology required for such weapons was previously produced from outside Russia. But the real reason seems to be that the Russians have spent most of their arsenals and that Russian industry has not yet been prepared to replace those used. After the Russian army's weapons stocks came to the point of depletion, Russia set its sights on foreign countries. Russia makes purchases from many countries to make up for the deficiencies in the Russian arsenal. Russia has procured a large number of attack aircraft from Iran, the most famous Shahed 136 and its cousins. Russia may have bought as many as 2,000 Iranian drones to date. Russia actively used Iran Shahed 136 in its attacks on Ukrainian city centers the other day. Rumor has it that Iranian ballistic missiles with a large of 700 kilometers, enough to cover the whole of Ukraine from Russia's own territory, may also be on the way. The shortage of weapons in Russia made the Russian army foreign dependent. The same problem applies to the Russian soldiers. The Russian army, which lost a large number of its soldiers in Ukraine, started a mobilization initiative involving 300,000 reserve soldiers to replace the losses. However, despite the completion of Putin's declaration of mobilization, he failed to become medicine for the Russian army. The main reason behind the failures of Russian reservists is that the troops mobilized into the Russian army are composed of untrained and inexperienced people. Russian leader Putin has launched a new plan to eliminate the training problem of mobilized soldiers. The Russian special unit, led by the Wagner Group, appealed to Afghan soldiers to include Afghan fighters in the Russian army. The most important feature of the Afghan soldier is that they were trained by the USA. Of course, Putin greatly enjoys the fact that many of them have been trained by the Americans as part of the now basically disbanded Afghan National Army. But it should be noted that such a move shows that the Russians are truly helpless. Much in the Ukraine-Russian war will depend on whether the Russians have enough resources to continue their operation until next year, and whether the West sticks to its word and continues to support Ukraine until the end. The Ukrainian warriors do not want to leave the work they started unfinished. The Ukrainians will not stop until they clear Russian soldiers from all Ukraine. Thanks for watching us.